Oh, nice.
Blocked.
That's what I'm talking about.
Safety. Mills to Collins, and Nico Collins barrels in for the touchdown. Fits it into VC for the touchdown. Trask under pressure, down he goes. Vincent Taylor leading the charge. Texans get a special teams play and looking for room down the sidelines to the 30-yard line.
And welcome to another episode of the Turn Up For What podcast, talking your Houston Texans straight from the Great British Isles. And the preseason is in the books. We're on to the real stuff. And I've been joined by one of the newer members of the Houston media, probably winning the crown for best hair, I'd say, and some great new articles as well coming out. I'm delighted to be joined by the Houston Chronicle's Brooks Kubena. Brooks, how you doing?
Doing great, man. Good to talk with you.
Yeah, no, thanks for the time. It's all been happening today, I suppose. But do you want to let us know a little bit about yourself? And you were covering SEC football before on LSU, but a Houston guy. How did working at the Chronicle come about?
Yeah, I actually grew up here in Houston, about 20 minutes from the stadium here in a suburb called Clear Lake. Started out going out to games out here, and grew up a fan of all these teams. And then whenever I started getting into journalism in high school, worked for the community newspapers out here, which basically are weeklies writing about high school stuff. And then went to Texas University here and started the career, went to the Beaumont Enterprise, which is in East Texas, covering high school sports and such, and like alligator stuff too, rodeos and fishing. It was a blast. And then to Little Rock, where I covered small college football. There's a school, Arkansas State, that plays in Division I. And then after that, went to cover LSU for the Advocate and the Times-Picayune in Baton Rouge in Louisiana, which, right now is getting hit with another hurricane, which is quite often the case every year out there. But LSU was, it was one of the best teams I'd ever gotten to cover, 2018 to 2019. In 2019, they won the national championship, and I consider them the best college football team in history for a lot of the things that they did, winning awards, the Heisman Trophy, and Joe Burrow, and winning the national championship and beating the competition that they had throughout the year was really an unprecedented thing in college football. And then they dropped off in 2020. A lot of players left. The pandemic happened. Lots of things happened on campus and off the field as well with the team. And then here in Houston, the job became available, and I applied for that, and I wanted to come back home and cover an NFL team. This is a team I'd always had my eye on, and a newspaper I always wanted to work for. So getting a chance to come in here, and it is an interesting situation. It's a team that's expected to struggle, but it's a team that's rebuilding here. New general manager, a new head coach. Coming into this, before they cut down the roster, there were 53 new players that they were choosing from out of a total of about 90 going into training camp. So from here on, the struggles that they had last year, they're building on. And it'll be interesting to see from the ground up how this team builds itself in the years to come.
Yeah, I suppose when you cover a team that's kind of, 7 days a week, pretty much 12 weeks a year now, particularly with NFL, how much did you kind of realize the issues of the last sort of 2 years and how we've kind of got to this point this year when you were working on other teams? Did you fully appreciate that, or has your understanding of where this team has been and got to change since you've seen, like, being in the building every day at training camp and things like that?
Yeah, well, it's kind of ironic, right? We're on a podcast here called Turn Up For What. That was like whenever I left Houston. This is where the face of the franchise is drafted. They're moving into the playoffs, and I'm in the press box here, and you can see the banners out on the field of how many division titles they won the past decade. And that's where things were while I was, gone. And then I come back here to the job, and last year, an immense struggle, mostly defensively with this team. And now the team now no longer is expected to ever have their franchise quarterback again in Deshaun Watson, who's facing some serious allegations, 22 civil lawsuits of sexual assault. And that is still not resolved either in the civil cases or in the criminal cases here in town or the NFL investigation that's going on. And today, that was kind of the big question was Deshaun Watson going to be part of the 53-man roster? And he, in fact, is, which means Nick Caserio, the first-year general manager, has to navigate through that, where he thought he might have had an extra spot to work with if he was put on the exempt list. But those exempt lists, there are criteria there that players need to be on. You have to be charged with a crime, which Watson has not. The NFL investigation has to present Roger Goodell, the commissioner, with enough evidence for him to feel that the policy within the NFL has been violated, which the investigation is still going. As of a couple of weeks ago, 10 of the 22 women who have filed civil lawsuits interviewed with the league, and that's still going to continue. And thirdly, in that criteria, there's some flexibility for Goodell to put someone on the exempt list if there is a crime of violence committed, and even if the investigations aren't done, he can put someone there temporarily. Why he hasn't done that, the NFL hasn't offered an explanation to that. I talked to David Coley today about that and wondered, all right, did you expect that Watson would be put on there? And he said that they haven't had any conversations with the league. Just one of the things that I was gleaning from it, you look at the exempt list, the players that have been placed on it recently are people who have been charged or accused of violent crimes. And over the most recent ones, there's been some criticism about the list because some feel that whenever someone gets placed on that list, the team gets to hold on to that player without any penalty. And they feel the criticisms are that a person should not be kept on a team. And there should be, some penalties for keeping that person on the team. So in Deshaun Watson's case, the Texans aren't going to release him. That wouldn't make much sense for them, as they're trying to get something back for what they believe is what we've seen to be an exceptional football player. And no other team is going to trade for him whenever they have all of these allegations that are still going through the investigative system. So this is going to continue for several more months, if not into next year. And that means Watson's going to take up a spot on this roster.
It's a funny predicament, I suppose, because you probably knew most of this offseason that he would be on the roster in some form, because the sort of clunky way in which the league kind of seemed to go about the disciplinary process. It follows no rhyme nor reason. It seems to vary from player to player, case to case. And yeah, you've kind of got a position where effectively the Texans are disadvantaged, perhaps through no fault of their own. And it's a strange situation. And I suppose, it's plausible that you've got a case whereby, going on his career history, that Tyrod Taylor picks up an injury, and he might be asked to suit up or face face potential fines and guarantee loss, etc. But it's quite a situation, and it seems to never quite find the next chapter. It seems to be in limbo, I think. I suppose it keeps it interesting, right? But it's a strange one.
Yeah, well, I talked with a couple of people today, people in town who have worked with civil lawsuits like this before, and just to gauge a timeline of how this goes. And things like this can take several months. They could take several years to resolve. So, we'll see how that ends up with the NFL's own investigation. But if Tyrod Taylor, and you're right, like the last two starting jobs that he had with the Browns and the Chargers, he both got passed up because of injuries in those cases. If that happens with Tyrod this year, they've already picked who they think might become their next franchise quarterback, a third-round pick in Davis Mills. And I've written about him a couple of times already this training camp, and he is probably the most interesting person on this roster. I say in a football sense, interesting on this roster, because depending on what he does and how he progresses throughout the year is going to tell Nick Caserio whether he has to spend a first rounder on a quarterback next year, and the Texans are likely to have a top 5 pick next year. Does he have to pursue one, or can they go and get something else, a pass rusher or someone in the secondary to help? It's going to be a big thing throughout this year to see where Mills is at. And Mills was a third rounder out of Stanford, and I think it's good context to show that when he was coming out of high school, he was the number 1 rated quarterback recruit in the country. Alabama wanted him. Every university wanted him. He suffered a knee injury going into college, and he decided to go to Stanford. He missed a couple of those years with 2 knee injuries there, and then was fully healthy. And last year, whenever the pandemic hit, the Pac-12, the conference in which Stanford plays out in the West, they initially canceled their football season. And it wasn't until a month or 2 in that they decided that they were going to come back. And a lot of teams weren't prepared for this. A lot of players weren't prepared for this. So Mills goes in and he plays in a limited season and a pandemic season, and decides to go to the NFL afterward. I'm of the opinion that if Mills had a full season and if he came back for another year, that he would be selected higher than he was in the 3rd round. He's got all of the tools that you can see in a prototypical quarterback. He's got the size, he's got the arm, he's got the awareness, but he's made a lot of rookie mistakes within training camp, which is expected. But you see some of that potential. He's very good throwing on the run. He's accurate throwing down the sideline in those tough, difficult passes. The things that he needs to work on, you've seen, have been more decision-making, not forcing balls in spots where he feels like he can make them. We've seen a couple of interceptions that way for him, but there's still a lot of potential for him. And if Tyrod Taylor does get hurt again, it's going to be Mills. And in some ways, for the long-term success of the team, that might give them a great evaluation of a player that allows them to decide what they have to do personnel-wise in the draft next year.
Yeah, and I suppose some people might kind of be unsure of that. Obviously, coming off a 4-pick performance on Saturday night, have you seen more in training camp than you have necessarily in the preseason games to show there's a maturation curve there? Because I think he's got some. I mean, he threw some terrible balls, right? Especially those outs. Didn't get the right angle on it. Left it inside. Always susceptible to get picked. And he tends to miss easy throws, or he kind of gets a bit lazy with his eyes at times, and it can be a good thing, because I think one of his strengths is he gets the ball out quick, but at times he tries to fit it into windows that maybe aren't there, or doesn't let the play develop. So have you seen more in the practice sessions and the 7-on-7s, etc., than you have in the game? Because I think the games have kind of wobbled around the line where it needs to be, because based on those alone, I think maybe people would be of the opinion that you maybe can't play him this year because he's not ready unless, ultimate emergency.
Yeah, in practices, at least to start in training camp, it was a struggle for Mills. There was one 7-on-7 drill in the red zone where he threw, I think, 4 or 5 interceptions in one drill in one day. And, a lot can be said around that and say, oh, this guy's struggling, always making bad decisions. In these 7-on-7 drills, you're gonna throw the ball. You're not just gonna tuck it and run. That doesn't make you have to throw the ball in these situations. So, it was actually in the preseason games, I think, especially in the second one against the Dallas Cowboys, that he showed his most potential than he did in practices. Like leading up to that week against the Cowboys, he had his best series of practices, making good decisions, some good throws. But it was against the Cowboys that I think you saw what you might see from him if he were to appear in a regular season game, making good decisions, not forcing the ball. And there was even a throw, I think, that kind of shows the full potential for him that happened in Green Bay. It wasn't even caught. I forget who was in the end zone, but he was rolling to his right.
Oh,
it was
Anthony
about a
Miller
4-yard pitch.
Yeah.
Threw it down into the end zone, and it glanced off the receiver's hands. But that's a difficult throw to drop in the end zone for that. And if that's caught, that's an amazing throw. I hesitate to say what potential there is for him in this offense so far, because we haven't seen much of a downfield passing game from the offense at all, even with Tyrod Taylor in yet. And I think they're being very reserved in that throughout the preseason. So, it's hard to judge him in just 1 month. And, we were talking about Deshaun Watson a second ago. Whenever he was here for his first month, like his first couple of practices were he was struggling too. This is not uncommon for rookies, no matter what their caliber is.
Yeah, no, I think so. There's probably a lot to there's a lot to like there. As you said, that one to Anthony Miller at the back of the end zone, it was just inches overthrown. There's a couple of inches. I think the fundamentals are there. I think it's probably just whether he can piece that together and continue to grow. And if his number's called at some point, then yeah, it might be sink or swim. And I think the trouble is that there probably isn't enough snaps. There isn't enough padded practices after only having 3 preseason games to allow him to develop and get him into a position where he might be better than he is now. So, he'll take mental reps, but we'll see with that. But I suppose probably the most important player, or one of, is Tyrod Taylor on this offense. They ran the ball better, and it looks like we're going to keep a whole host of running backs. We'll come on to the personnel decisions from Nick in the front office there. But in terms of this offense, do you think they're going to be able to achieve the identity they want to in running the ball and being reasonably balanced, but a ground heavy attack? Because until Tampa Bay, it didn't seem like they probably had that personnel. I know Marcus Cannon's come back today, which was a bit of a surprise, and he may well help in that. But do you think they can achieve the identity they want with Tyrod on offense to be competitive this season?
It's probably the biggest question about this offense. So David Culley, first-time head coach, comes into this team. Last 2 years he's been with the Ravens, and that's the kind of run game he wants to have with the Texans. And that's part of the reason why Mark Ingram is here. Played for the Ravens the last 2 years, was a Pro Bowler in 2019. I mean, who wouldn't want the 2019 Ravens offense? If you look back at what they did, they were the first team in the NFL history to average 200 yards passing and 200 yards rushing per game. And that has a lot to do with what they were doing in the ground. If you look at the way their offense was set up, they carried 3 tight ends and a fullback. And the way they ran their personnel on the offense, I watched a game the other day just for reference, and a lot of times you're seeing multiple tight end sets with a fullback, power runs, pulling tackles, pulling guards. There's the identity there that if they keep hammering a defense with runs, it'll eventually open up things in the pass. Linebackers, safeties coming in, 8 players in the box, and then that opens up to spread open the field. And that's things Lamar Jackson was able to do very well because he could stretch a defense out just by extending a play by rolling out and such. And they have to account for him as yet another runner. So seeing what the Texans did with either keeping a fullback or how they would arrange their tight ends was going to be really interesting. And we got that answer today. They have 3 tight ends, and they decided not to carry a fullback. So, I mean, that really kind of tells you this is not the Ravens. This is what the Texans are going to do. One of the things that I know you guys have noticed over the years is that Tim Kelly, the offensive coordinator, loves to use tight ends in many different ways. That's not going to change here this year. There's just going to be an added part to that. These tight ends are going to be expected to play fullback in certain situations. You look at a guy like Pharaoh Brown, who last year was a red zone threat and played along with Jordan Akins. He's got the size that can be a blocker in an I formation or a pistol set where you use a fullback. And the things that I think will be creative about this team is if they're able to establish the run, you've got a tight end at fullback or that can help you out and maybe give you more options as a receiver. And that's not just in a given play. I'm not just saying like, all right, so they're in an I formation set and all of a sudden, Pharaoh Brown's going to run a go route and they're just going to throw a touchdown to him. It's more in the flow of a game. So if you're running an I formation, you've got him there as playing a fullback, you can keep your same personnel on the field on the next play and then go 5 wide and you've got a receiver there in the slot and you don't have to change So the defense has to keep itself there, and you can be flexible and multiple in the way that the offense is running. To go to your question, all that depends on whether the run game can be good. We didn't see that until like one drive against the Buccaneers on Saturday. Most of their starters, Ingram, David Johnson, Philip Lindsay, these guys were only averaging around 3 yards a carry. That's just not going to cut it. And it's not enough of a threat to open up the pass game. So they definitely have to get that going. And this is the AFC South is a division where there's some strong defenses, and they're going to play other strong defenses throughout the year that are going to look to stop their run. And that's something that you struggled at mightily last year. They were second to last in run yards per game, I believe. And that has to change. The offensive line is interesting. Culley has talked a lot about challenging them, although I do think, the running backs have a definite part of this. The push wasn't necessarily there the first couple of games. The offensive line here, has gone through some changes. So Titus Howard, a former first-round pick, was playing right tackle the last 2 years. Now he's at left guard. He's looked good there. The push there is, they like his size and what he's able to do there. And then Max Sharping is at right guard. The person that was seemingly going to help them out at the guard position was Lane Taylor, who had started for the Packers whenever he was healthy. But he's now scratched because he's not. They cut him today. So that interior is going to be the biggest thing. Is Titus Howard going to progress as a guard? Is Sharping going to take that next step? They signed Justin Britt, who played center for the Seahawks and has played other spots there too, and he's looked good throughout the preseason in spots. But are they going to get that push? It's the biggest question of this offense.
Yeah, it's funny because you think of we've almost made more changes perhaps than we necessarily needed to, and I think Charlie Hicks definitely improved with his athleticism. But I put out a clip today. There was a play where he ran the wrong way. I think that was in the second quarter. And I think he's still got a lot to develop. And I think as well, when you've made the changes you have, when you've moved Sharp from left to right guard, when you've moved Titus from right tackle to left guard, you bring in a new center. And I always blame Mike Devlin for this last year, because continually flip-flopping from power to zone, because you saw they ran 2 power plays back to back. And then the big gain, or the highlight reel that probably everybody's seen with David Johnson, was more of a kind of inside zone concept. And you saw Charlie Hicks just get his body out enough and widen the angle to open up a gap for him to run through. So I always think when I watched that, and when I watched it last year, it seemed like it was unsustainable to try and be proficient at both disciplines. I think it's quite a challenge, and particularly when you add all the changes into that. It may work for a couple of weeks. You saw week 1 last year, David Johnson looked great, and it slowly faded. And towards the end of the season, he kind of picked up a little, but it seemed like fool's gold. So it's a strange mishmash of changes. I think to hope for huge production gains when you've made so many changes, and some of them feel a little bit unnecessary.
Yeah, and with all of that, you mentioned last year offensive line, and I think the interesting thing here to think about some of the schemes that they're going to run. I mean, this is a team that will use some zone. We saw some zone run schemes in the preseason games. I think it will be a lot of pulling guards, pulling tackles, pulling tight ends even throughout this. I think there'll be a lot more power focus, but I think the main difference is when you bring in the new offensive line coach, James Campen. He spent most of his career as an offensive line coach with the Green Bay Packers. Someone described it to me like this: the blocking concept is, it's legal holding is what it would someone call me. It's basically, if you think about how college teams and even NFL teams have taken advantage of certain NFL rules where, such as the run pass option schemes, knowing that you can move offensive linemen down the field to make it look like run, and all of a sudden it's a pass. Defenses have been ticked off by that in the past 5 years, but that's exploitation of a rule. in the same way, there's some rules there within the blocking schemes where, basically offensive linemen, you'll see their hand placements as long as they're moving, as long as they're driving and consistent motion, you'll see that they've got a little bit of a grip on their defensive line. So, there's parts of that, but I think focusing on blocking schemes and some changes there are definitely one of the things that Coley's looking for to get this run game going.
Yeah, and it's surprised by, well, obviously Cannon comes back, and you hope that's going to make a difference. But I think, I suppose he's got a lot of making up to do. So it's hard to see him probably starting week 1. You think that's Heck's spot, and probably the line is set with Tunsil coming back and coming off the COVID list this week. We'll come back onto some of the personnel decisions, but in terms of watching Brady run up and down the field twice there, went up tempo, picked the soft spot in the zones for about the third game in a row under Lovie Smith. We're starting to see that the linebacker depth versus the safety depth, when they're playing off coverage zone, they seem to, the seam route is there to be exploited, and it's happened in every game so far. There was obviously gave up a run for the score, for the second touchdown there that was easy. And again, people got bad pursuit angles, got caught inside. Do you think this defense, when it went, and look, I mean, the top three receivers there for Tampa are probably, the best three on paper in the league, but I thought the team got caught out, and a guy like Desmond King was miles off Chris Godwin, 2 or 3 yards of separation at times, and it made me concerned about the passing defense. And I think I've talked about that a lot of this offseason, Brooks, that I think signing Mitchell and Desmond King was a step in the right direction, but you've got Bradley Roby missing week 1. And I don't see for the life of me why Vernon Hargreaves is still on this team. He's shown that in multiple games, including that running touchdown. So is it right that we've got concerns about this defense, particularly in the passing defense? And is it going to be enough to stand up?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned probably the biggest thing there was how open the seams were with Brady, and he exploited that time and time again. It's a common opening in the Tampa 2 defense where you've got this zone right in between, linebackers and safeties right up in that seam, and people who are accurate and can create, the right kind of look can exploit that. This is a defense that's still learning a lot under its transition with Lovie Smith. And that was the first time that defense had faced a starting quarterback all preseason. It just so happens to be the future Hall of Famer Tom Brady. So he's going to show the problems within this. And, how that develops is definitely a question. Bradley Roby is going to be sitting out that first week against Jacksonville. So, you expect Vernon Hargreaves to start in that position. So is that something that Jacksonville, with its new number 1 overall pick, Trevor Lawrence at quarterback, try and exploit throughout the game? A smart person would say yes, looking at where things are. I mean, has the secondary improved with some of the additions it's made? I think one of the things that'll be interesting to watch is where does Lonnie Johnson fit into the mix here? Eric Murray and Justin Reed are the starting safeties right now. And the thing is, Justin Reed is a free safety who loves to react, hawk on the ball. This defense expected to force lots of turnovers. They're making an emphasis of that. His style of play is a lot similar to what Lonnie Johnson is trying to do as well. Do they fit together, playing side by side in the same scheme? I'm not sure. Eric Murray likes to play up in the box. How they play in coverage together is going to be interesting for sure. And we saw a limited basis of that, 3 drives from Brady. But if you start looking at the schedule, that's going to be pretty much the toughest quarterback they're going to face. You've got Lawrence, Tennessee with Ryan Tannehill. He's going to be out for a little while with COVID. What's he going to be like when he gets back? There's very few playoff quarterbacks that they're going to see throughout the year. I wouldn't – the thing that is probably the most concerning is, does this run defense get any better? That's part of the things that I've been looking at. Is that was their entire struggle last year. They ranked last in stopping the run, and they've made a lot of changes on the defensive line to do that. And I think how the defensive line plays against these quarterbacks, whether they're able to get pressure, is going to help a lot of the secondary issues. We saw a lot of that in the preseason against backups, and reserves. Guys like Malik Collins in the middle who are getting upfield and creating pressure. Charles Omenihu, who's getting several sacks. They didn't do that against Brady whenever he was in the first 3 drives. So if you give any quarterback enough time to sit back there and decide what they want to do, they're going to find those kind of throws that are up the seam. That takes time to develop. And that's part of the reason why it's designed that way, is if you can get pressure there, then that's not going to be an issue. So, whether all those things work in tandem together is going to be the real question within the Texans defense this year.
The guys up front, I think, probably the most improved section of this team, I think, by some stretch. But I suppose,
I'd agree.
Yeah, but I suppose all we've seen up to this point is guys beating backups and going against second, third tier guys that might not even be will have been released today. So I think that's the struggle, and I think, can you consistently get pressure with only 4 men up front? And I don't think they will, and I think they'll have to bring another guy. So you're asking more on the back end, and you're going to take a safety out more than not, I think. So there's some concerns at the linebacker play in terms of pass coverage. So I think it's probably just a point to note that, that's about as good as it gets, and it's about as proficient, all 22 years experience, knowing exactly the player and the spot to go after. But it's there to be exploited against the upper echelons, and we play Justin Herbert, whoever suits up for San Francisco, and there'll be a couple of there'll be Sam Bradford as well in there. So there's going to be guys who are going to be able to do the exact same thing to us, but it will be a test of time. Just quickly, it's not the most attractive topics, but I think it is worth a note of the Frank Ross and the job he's done in special teams. A couple of blocked field goal twice, or an extra point and a field goal on Saturday. Consistently returning the ball well, seemed to be well set up in terms of blocking lanes, etc. We've not always been used to that in Houston, but I think it could be an underrated facet of this team, because I suppose special teams and turnovers on defense are two things that can keep you in games that you've got no right to be in. So I think they're kind of two positives. I don't know how sustainable they are, but what have you thought of Frank Ross and the job he's done getting these guys ready for 21?
With the additions they've made, I think it's unquestionably the best unit on the team. Offense, defense, special teams. Texans best at special teams, and in a year that they're expected to struggle, I guess you guys are going to have to, take your, be satisfied in watching good special teams play and let that take over for the year. But one of the things you could see it in the additions they made. First off, like their punter, Cameron Johnston.
Might be the best player in the team.
Booming kicks, man. 61-yard punts and averaging, I think, in the mid-50s right now. And not just that. Remember against Tampa Bay, he pinned one like the 3. Yeah. And, that's going to be huge for the team if down the line and he remains to be a part of the team. Field position's huge in that. He's a former Aussie Rules football player. He's been in the league for a little bit now. He's got a hold of how to, stop that ball within the 10. The other thing about this team too that they added Andre Roberts. They've never had a kick returner of his caliber. He's been in the league for 12 years for a reason. Teams don't generally hold a spot open for you if you're just going to be a kick return specialist unless you're really, really good. And that's what he's been. He's been an all-pro before. He's been a Pro Bowler before. The Texans have had guys like Jerome Mathis and J.J. Moses who've done well in kick returning, but not to the sustainability that the Texans, I think, are going for here. Does Andre Roberts do that? We haven't got a chance to see him yet. Hasn't played in any of the 3 preseason games they had. He was dealing with an injury. But Desmond King has been returning punts in his place, and he had that 63, I think 43-yard punt return against the Packers. Looked good. Again, this is reserve units and the preseason, but how is this return game going to look? I think that's one of the big questions. And is Roberts worth the roster spot that they gave him? We're going to see that in game 1. The biggest thing anybody ever notices with special teams is, the kicker and whether he can be consistent. Is Kaimi Fairbairn going to take that step to be the kicker that he was signed to be? I mean, the contract that was given to him, it's a lot for a kicker. And he's made his field goals throughout the year. I mean, the preseason so far, is he going to maintain that consistency? He didn't kick against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers because he pulled a muscle during warmups, and he's expected to be back by week 1. But the overwhelming majority of this special teams unit is going to improve. Fairbairn's, I think, the only question right now going into this season, and that may just be the biggest part of the special teams. So how does he perform? That's going to be a big question. But, the other thing is with this team, we're talking about field goals and such. With a team with as little room for error, I think David Culley understands this, and he's talked about this to us before about 4th downs and such. Whenever it becomes like a 4th and short and they're in enemy territory, they're probably going to go for it. I don't know how much Fairbairn will be a factor in some of these things, because they're going to try and get these touchdowns where they can, because they are expected to be a struggling team. They are the underdog in these things. So I feel like we'll see more aggression out of the offense this year.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think they will have to go for it. They'll have to eke out, and I think it's, especially if that pass defense is there to be attacked, and they could potentially project a gulf of 7-14, maybe even 21 points a game, and you've got an offense like that long drive that we saw, 10, 12 plays, taking 4 or 5 minutes off the clock every time you get the ball. They're not going to be able to score all that quickly, or not have that extra gear that some teams might have, or the gear that you'll give other teams by not being great on the back end. So they're going to have to be efficient as possible, I think, and it probably starts with the guys up front. But in terms of the moves then that we've made, so on Sunday or Monday night, can't remember now, but Shaq Lawson was traded, which I think a lot of people right from the get-go kind of said this isn't going to work out. Ironically, Benardrick McKinney's released the day after in Miami. It's a trade that hasn't worked out, but I suppose is it reasonable to question Caserio's trades to this point? There's been a few, and none particularly have seen any payoff yet as we stand today.
Right. I think it's still a little early here with Caserio, because if you look at it this way, I think when you bring in Shaq Lawson, you're getting a look at a guy for relatively minor cost. The cap hits and such are things that are going to work around in the future. And, you traded him for an asset in Benardrick McKinney, who was a 3-4 inside linebacker who was going to get cut anyway. Yeah. So you take a moderate financial hit to take a look at a guy that whenever they traded for him, he seemed like he was going to be their best pass rusher. It just didn't pan out the way that it looked coming out of that. So, that is going to be a knock on Caserio right now. But as these things continue, like we saw a couple of trades brought in, another cornerback that eventually got cut today, traded a 7th rounder for him, and the trades that they're, basically most of the trades have been 6th, 7th round picks that we've seen from Caserio just to build depth or create competition in certain sets. So there hasn't been the big trade yet that I think defined general managers yet from him. But it's the small ones that I think, and I was talking to someone about this the other day, is like, one of the things from the Patriots that he was learning was like, they like to create competition. Not that general managers don't, but if you look at a lot of the moves that he's made, it's in situations of depth, like defensive line, like cornerback, like those places where, there were, some people on the fringe about what were they going to decide, were they going to keep guys or not. And by bringing in new guys, you get a better look out of the ones you already have as well. So, Shaq Lawson's a big name, was a first-round pick before and didn't end up being the pass rusher he was, but they got to look at a guy for a pretty relatively cheap price, and by giving away a guy that ended up getting cut by the Dolphins too in McKinney. So, we'll see for several more years. I don't think Caserio is going to go anywhere after the team struggles this year. It's expected to happen. This is a full rebuild.
Yep.
So, we'll get a chance to see some of the bigger moves that he makes. And I expect it not to be a quiet year when there are a lot of players on this team who probably won't be here a year or two from now.
Yeah, well, that's right. I think there is 20-something players, 23 players here that are on one-year deals.
On
as
defense,
yeah. So as the 53 is set today, it's kind of 52 when you've got Deshaun kind of sulking in the background. But obviously this is going to be so fluid, like you said. I think there'll be waiver wire pickups. There's a couple of spots here they look kind of short at. But if you look at the defense in isolation, I suppose the three that I got wrong, that I put my prediction out this morning, was Jaleel Johnson. Didn't see that coming. I actually had Jordan Jenkins not on the team, and then I saw he was in front of the media today, so I instantly knew I got that wrong.
Yeah.
So I thought Jordan Jenkins, just some of the tape I watched, I don't think he sets the edge particularly well, and I think that's just a concern, and I thought that might count against him. I thought Grenard would maybe have gone on to IR or the IR, because you can do 3 weeks this year. And Kadar Holman, I thought when you trade for a guy, you give up a late pick, albeit loose change, I suppose. But I wasn't. They were the three that I got wrong. And then I suppose with AJ Moore coming in, didn't see that. And then the one was Neville Hewitt. I thought he looked a bit short in pass coverage. So between Hewitt, Jenkins, between Johnson, Hewitt, and Holman, what do you think was the biggest surprise there, or did you kind of see them coming?
Well, one of the ones that I didn't see coming was Kika QT. I mean, him getting replaced was huge. I mean, that's been one of their big slot receivers for now, and I guess they feel good in Anthony Miller, but he's got a shoulder separation, shoulder dislocation, hasn't been in any of these preseason games. Do they feel confident that he's going to be healthy throughout the year? I mean, they're only carrying 5 wide receivers right now.
Yeah, it looks
and they've got 5 running backs. I thought that for sure that when you had Mark Ingram, David Johnson, Philip Lindsay, who all started in places previously, and David Johnson also obviously the center of a major trade that changed the focus of the franchise here. And then they signed Rex Burkhead. It didn't seem like all 4 of them were going to make it. Whenever you looked at the rest of the roster, a lot of the talk was which out of those 4 was going to be the short straw. Well, now they have 5. It's Scotty Phillips. So, they really are going to run the ball. But I do think when you think of Bradley Roby being on the he's going to be suspended for that first game after the PED suspension last year. He's going to serve the final of a 6th game. I think Scotty Phillips is probably going to be the one that gets moved to the practice squad afterward. But, you mentioned some of those guys, defensive line. I thought Jenkins, did he show everything that acquiring him as a pass rusher, setting the edge, those kinds of things, not quite in the preseason. But this is going to be a major level of depth. There's 10 defensive linemen on the roster right now for the Texans. And Lovie Smith has talked about this time and again. They need a rotation. They need to be deep there. And I think, as the season goes on, they still want to have as many options there as possible because, we talked about its influence on the secondary. They need to have guys that might be able to step out throughout the year. And I think Jenkins is someone who still has a relatively high ceiling in this defense. But out of the players that I was looking at who got cut today, most of them were, pretty expected other than QT. But also Paul Quessenberry getting cut, the fullback that was on the team, that was going to tell me a lot about how this went. We already talked about that earlier in the show. So, out of those are the ones that were most surprising to me.
Yeah, Kiki, I suppose it's a strange one in some ways, but when you saw him playing in the fourth quarter of a couple of preseason games, the writing is on the wall inevitably, I think, in those kind of situations. But you've only gone with one slot receiver. Of the five, Andrew Roberts is one. So I think it's probably unquestionable that they will make a move at that spot. I saw Smokey Brown's been released by the Raiders. I know the Texans were in the bidding process and free agency for him. And he's somebody a skill set they probably don't have right now in terms of speed to stretch the field, keep safeties honest, and try and balance out your passing attack a little. Because we don't really have we do have Brandon Cooks, but he's probably not quite the sort of true burner field stretcher that he was. So, I think there's definitely a move to be made there. And I had a theory when I saw that, Brooks. I think that, and it never quite materialized last year, but it was talked about when they signed, they traded from an ill-fated trade, right enough. But the route running of David Johnson, you've not seen him run the ball a huge amount. Do you think you could see him lining up in the slot, quite regularly at the start of the season to give you an option there, considering you've only got Anthony Miller, who might not even be fit to go week one?
Well, I do think he'll be definitely used in the passing game a lot. In the limited time that we saw in the preseason, he seemed to be in a third down back role. But having Rex Burkhead on the team too, that was kind of his role with the Patriots and others that he's been with before. So where does Johnson fit in this? It's a good question. I think even ever since David Johnson got traded here in Houston, that fitting him into this offense has been a question, especially whenever they're trying to power run. I think mostly I think he's mostly going to be used as a depth running back here. There is obviously an emphasis on running the ball. Ingram, Lindsey, and I think Johnson's pretty much had the best preseason. He's had the longest run among them. Ingram seems to be like he's going to be the every down back who can take a couple of hits as he continues to go. We saw him do that in the preseason games where I think it was a 10-play drive against the Buccaneers, and he had most of those, and they were either 3 or 4 yards, and he was just plowing right up the middle. I think that's probably where David Johnson fits into this, is coming into those third down situations and being a guy who can run in a stretch zone situation. Lindsey too. But you mentioned Brandon Cooks there. I think he still has some deep threat potential. The thing about the wide receivers that I think is interesting when you look at the group, they're all trees, 6'3", 6'4". They definitely looked for size when it came to acquiring these guys. Getting Chris Conley, who came from Jacksonville, was a number 2 option for them for a couple of years, 240 catch seasons for him. They're looking for mismatches. And I think a lot of this is going to be playing out in a downfield passing game that we have not yet seen. Nico Collins, going for him, another large receiver out of Michigan who has some upside. I think he would have been drafted higher if he had played last year instead of opting out with Michigan with concerns over the coronavirus. Those size advantages, if they can find them, are going to reveal to me and us a little bit about what this downfield passing option can be. David Culley's talked about how Tyrod Taylor succeeded at that when he was in Buffalo several years ago. And he indeed was one of the best downfield passers while he was with the Bills in Greg Roman's system. Greg Roman, offensive coordinator at the time, linked up with the Ravens, and that's where Culley saw a lot of this run game, pass game that he wants to implement with the Texans. I think a lot of that will have influence on what they run here. So I look at the bodies at wide receiver, and I think they're really going to try and push the ball in certain spaces. And again, goes to that run game. So where does David Johnson fit? I think it's mostly in the run game. I don't think we'll see him as much as a slot receiver, but there are situations where they will put him out at receiver. I'm not sure if that'll be his main role in this offense, though.
Yeah, I suppose it's vanilla, right, in the preseason, but we probably have seen a lot of the concepts and not a huge variation from the Bill O'Brien, Tim Kelly learned playbook. And I always remember when they tried to mix in Tyler Irvin into that, and it never quite worked out. But I remember just watching them in Denver and 2016, and them trying to get Tyler Irvin, and it actually was quite effective. But again, with O'Brien, he used to flip flop out of stuff that was working for them. But yeah, and obviously he blew out his knee on a return, and he kind of lost the season. Tyler Irvin, when they took him out of San Diego State, but I think he's put, that was a potential role they carved out, and even on that failed fourth down attempt, actually, David Johnson makes a great run right in the middle of the zone, picks up the space while Tyrod's feet just get a little bit happy, and he gets flushed out, and he ends up trying to turns into a scramble drill effectively and misses him in the end zone. They turn over and downs, but I think there might be a role there for David Johnson that might not be running the ball as much as he has done in the past, but it will be committee. I think that's for sure. Whether all these guys will be here, people are potentially touting a return for Mark Ingram to Baltimore with J.K. Dobbins blowing his knee at the weekend. So I think there will be a lot to move, and the wide receiver position looks incomplete on paper. And one injury to that spot, just like cornerback, I think you're in a world of pain there right now. But there's certainly some interesting moves, I think, there. But yeah, keeping that many running backs, I don't think anybody saw that. But Scotty Phillips, I think, has been a guy who deserved his chance, and every time he's been on the field, he's done well. And I think at any position, it's a young man's position as running back. So I would like to hope that we'd maybe look at one of those veteran guys to go when you need to make a move. But yeah, as you said, I think Caserio will keep churning as he has done. But as we sit here today, Brooks, we've got 10, 11 days till the opener. Has your view changed of this team through the preseason process?
Well, I'm not sure how much of it has changed because there are still so many questions that remain. So I arrived here with a lot of questions, and out of training camp, we have same questions. I think some have been answered, like what will the roster look like, and that was the main one. But how effective will it be? That's still up for question here. Especially seeing the defense struggle against Brady throughout the training camp. There were feelings that the defense was going to take major strides. So where is that going to be? I still think this is going to be a team that struggles. There's my read of David Culley and seeing him day to day and some of the players and how they feel about him. This is not going to be a team, I think, that has trouble with consistency week to week. Obviously, everybody has confidence in the preseason. You haven't lost yet. You haven't lost multiple games in a row yet. You haven't had a big drought yet. So, if that happens in the middle of the season, we'll see how that goes. And I think that's going to be the major challenge here with this team is whenever things start to go bad, will things be able to move in a positive direction for them? Are they going to be able to pull themselves out of ruts? This is going to be a team that's probably going to struggle. So, what do they do when those things happen? How many adjustments are the coaching staff and the players able to make? And are they just simply outmatched week to week? Can they find exploitative game plans for them to work in these things? And I'm not saying that this matters or should really have any play into it, but the NFL does their top 100 players every year, and the Texans, one player within that was their left tackle, Laramie Tunsil. So this is a team that lacks star power, offense, defense. It's what players surprise us or surprise me. Those are the questions that I want that we'll see throughout the year. Is this a team that looks like it's going on the upward trend? That's the storyline of this year. This is the rebuild. This is ground zero for Nick Caserio in his first time as a general manager. Are they making the moves and making the progression towards being a team that could put 5 or 6 more AFC South banners up there like there are behind me? So that's going to be the main focus, and for me, just seeing how they progress throughout the year.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a there's almost a train of thought. This is the reset, and until the Watson situation clears up, the rebuild then commences post that point. So,
Sure.
there's a lot of kind of questions to be answered. And I suppose that's why you play the games, and that's why we'll kind of get ready each Sunday. Brooks, before we head out here, you've been to Lambeau Field up at Jerry World last week. You were in our NRG. Have you got any spots on this year's calendar that you've got circled that you're particularly looking forward to? Or and also, have you had a sort of welcome to the NFL moment yet in terms of covering this team? Has it been your expectations?
Well, I've got a quick story. You can actually see it behind me. So this is where, and if you're just listening to it, I'll describe it too for you. There's these seats here in the press box. And whenever I was at the Beaumont Enterprise, this small paper in East Texas, back in 2016, I came to cover my first game. And I went and met John McClain, who has been covering Houston professional sports for 40 years. I grew up listening to him, reading him, all this. To me, he was a legend, and still is. Working for him is kind of surreal. But I walked over to him and I said, "Hey, I'm Brooks Kubena." I stuck my hand out. How's it going? I was like, "Oh, this is my first game." He says, "Is your first game, huh?" I was like, "Yeah." He sticks his arm out, puts it over the field, and he's like, "Welcome to the NFL." And I was like, now McClain says that I'm here. That was the moment. And now I'm, through the interview process, I told him that story, and he's like, "Well, I hope to be able to tell you that again." And he did whenever I arrived. And he's been joking with me because my first 2 road trips, where we take a plane, I drove to Dallas, but the first one was Lambeau Field, which is incredible. I mean, that's title town. That's where, Lombardi had built one of the best teams ever. And just, that stadium in the middle, just drinking beer and eating cheese and whatever, they really are. They're the nicest people ever.
Yeah.
Even the Uber drivers and everybody, just the whole town was Packer Central and cared about it and were very kind to you anywhere you went, whether you wanted some food, whatever you wanted. That was awesome. But, Cleveland is going to be the first road trip of the regular season. Yeah. And I'm going to go down, and John McClain was inducted into the Hall of Fame several years ago, but he's got a bust in Canton that he's never seen, and I'm going to go with him. So the first 2 trips, John's like, you're going to get to go to the Pro Football Hall of Fame. You're going to get to Lambeau Field. And there are diehard NFL fans who would kill to go do that, and they've never been able to do that in their life. So I'm pretty lucky to get the first couple of trips there on that. But Miami is always fun. Buffalo is going to be cool because I've never been there, and I want to go see Niagara Falls in my spare time out there. They play San Francisco. I mean, look, I'm coming from covering the SEC where it was like, hey, let's go to, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and you're just driving through, and there ain't nothing between Baton Rouge and there. So covering the NFL, the road trips, a little better.
Yeah, I've always maintained that the best bit or the most fun I've ever had watching this team has been in the road games. Because you end up in places and end up in bars talking to people you would never have been there in a million years otherwise. So Buffalo was the one that intended to go this year. But the CDC guidelines are not letting any travel yet. So watching it every day, and then the backup plan's probably Miami. We've got some friends that live there, so yeah, it would be good to get to a game. But before we go, you did say you were going to give your uncle in London a plug. I take it was he at the London game? It was a very strange experience. It was a very kind of odd day to see as many people not in Houston wearing the colours and wearing the jersey, things like that. It was kind of strange, but it was an experience, and it's probably all kind of gone downhill actually, ironically, from that day onwards. Really, it's never quite been the same. But you got an uncle, you said, Brooks, in London.
Yeah. His name's Blake Kubena. I just want to give him a shout out. Hey, what's up, Blake? I want to come out and visit. I'm actually thinking about flying out there next year whenever hopefully things open up more and more. So he's actually an actor. He's in a play that's going to come up called Jekyll and Hyde. So if you're in the London area and want to see some theater there, I'll vouch for him. It's a good show. But I wanted to tell him hello, and I love traveling, and I love I'm very happy to be invited to be on this podcast because football is such an interesting sport and reaches far places. And when I was at Baton Rouge, I wrote a story about how much the game has progressed in Sweden. So like this is a game that's becoming global. And I mean, you guys have seen NFL games in London too. So out there. So I'm interested to see where that goes. Does a team eventually go out there? I mean, that's always been a question for years. So we'll see.
Yeah, I don't think it's probably sustainable, but what would be probably a development league, and obviously Kurt Warner's the biggest example of that, is having a developmental league between European cities, particularly Germany. And it seemed like the Texans were all set to play in Germany. Deshaun was on adverts and posters all over there, so that's probably hit the tracks a bit. But yeah, no, I think it's we've had some amazing people over. We did some fan roundtables over the off season, all different countries, people coming in. But it's all people like yourself, Brooks, the hospitality, the time that everybody gives us every week. I'm very humbled that you can come and talk this team that certainly keeps it interesting for us. And it's about to get a little bit more interested in the true sense because we're about to have some games. So, Brooks, thank you very much for your time, mate. Much appreciated.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Anytime.
Yeah, no worries. Well, that was Brooks Kubena from the Houston Chronicle. We'll be back next week in a limbo week without the fourth preseason game to talk a little more Texans football as we get ready for week 1 in Jacksonville. If you haven't already, check out the articles on podcasttexans.com, and we'll be back again next week.